Hi, everybody, and welcome to Forum 2022. I'm Ann Delano Steinert, and I'm the director of the Center for the City at the University of Cincinnati and a visiting assistant professor in the history department. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a minute, but first, I want to just say that we're here this panel today. Thanks for getting up so early. This panel is Rethinking Integrity, the Problem of Cincinnati's Black History Sites, with myself, Carlton Collins, and Rory Krupp. And I'm going to give them all a chance to introduce themselves in just a second. I have a couple housekeeping things I have to do first. So first of all, if you are hoping to get continuing education credits from this session, all you need to do is scan the QR code at the back of the room, or you can go online and enter your information electronically. AIA members need to remember to enter their member number when they sign in, and members of the AICP just know that you're responsible for self-reporting that you were here. So we're so glad that you've joined us. I want to just tell you a little bit about the structure of this session and let you know that it's going to be a teensy bit shorter than originally intended. So you can see that both Rory and I are here by video. We have had crazy things happen in our lives since we initially planned this session. So we're just making the best of it, and we're grateful for your patience. But I have been awarded the Society for Architectural Historians Brooks Traveling Fellowship. So I'm right now sitting in Vienna, Austria. And Rory, when he introduces himself, will tell you a little bit about where he is maybe. And then Carlton, of course, is with you guys live, which is awesome. So because of this sort of wacky circumstance where we're partly in the room and partly not in the room, we're going to actually shorten up the session a little bit. So we're going to do the session in 3 30-minute chunks. And instead, I think we're going to do it in 3 20-minute chunks. So we'll be finished a little early and you'll get a little extra time to get your morning coffee. So the structure of the session is going to be, like I said, 3 distinct chunks. So the first one is going to be Rory and I talking about the big ideas about what integrity is in historic preservation and what that means and how it impacts our field. And then the second part will be Carlton and I offering 2 case studies of Black history sites in Cincinnati that have integrity problems, strictly defined in a sort of historic preservation way. And then the last chunk of time we'll spend together, we're going to give you some discussion questions, and we're going to encourage you to discuss some of these problems that we've presented as a group, and then present those out to hopefully create sort of brainstorm ideas to move us forward as a field in the future a little more equitably. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and instead you're going to see Rory and I. Let's see if I can get us next to each other. There we go. Okay, so just to kind of start, I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to let Rory go, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about sort of why we dreamed up this session. So like I said, my name's Ann Delano Steinert. I have a BA and a master's in historic preservation. I worked for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission a little while in the late 90s. I've worked in museums, I've worked in schools, I've worked in high schools and colleges, but all of my work as an educator and a preservationist and an urbanist has really been about figuring out the ways that buildings tell their stories and the way that we communicate the history of the built environment. So that's sort of where this problem really lives. And so it's sort of right at the heart of the things that I do. For work right now, I'm a visiting assistant professor, as I said, at the University of Cincinnati in the history department. I teach public history. I teach some African-American history. I taught a course called African-American History in Public that took on one of these case studies that we're going to talk about today. And I really specialize in the history of American cities, particularly in the late 19th century. So that's me, and I'll turn it over to Rory.
My name is Rory. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I'm a principal with a historic preservation firm Owen in Eastlake. We do a lot of African-American history and historical sites, districts, and that type of thing. And while you're sitting there, I'm in the Missouri Historic Advisory Board meeting right now, trying to explain the integrity of a site in Joplin, Missouri.
And Rory, that just came up, right? Like the schedule just changed like a week or so ago, right?
Well, I guess I looked at my calendar and then here I am. So, right. So,
so here we are. We're making the best of it. Yeah. Okay, so we want to talk about this idea of integrity. And the reason that I was drawn to this is the two case studies that Carlton and I are going to talk about later are relatively recent things that have happened or are happening in Cincinnati, where really important moments in Black history in particular were not able to be preserved or saved because of the changes that happened to the buildings over time, so that the buildings were not in their pristine, perfect, intact condition, which caused people to sort of look askance at them and think like, oh, that building's not so important, we're not going to worry about it. And so as you'll hear later, one of those buildings was actually even lost. So I thought we would start by kind of defining what integrity is. Obviously, most of you in the room are preservation practitioners, and this will be all review for you. But if there's anyone in the room who isn't familiar, basically, the National Park Service defines integrity as the ability of a property to convey its historical associations or attributes. So how well does it tell you what it is or why it's important? But the hiccup there is that that's through all the years of our profession, that's almost exclusively been defined as architectural significance. And this, of course, comes from the beginning of the National Register in 1966, when we were really saving places that were perfectly architecturally pristine examples of things. But over time, as we've realized that we want to diversify what we save and the kinds of stories that we tell and the cultural heritage that we commemorate, we have, it's as if our goals for preservation, and Ray Rass says this in an article I'll talk about later, but it's as if our goals for historic preservation and our methods for historic preservation don't line up anymore. So Rory, I wanted to kind of turn over to you. I know that you have dealt with this issue in practice in your work. I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little bit about how that issue of integrity or perceived lack of integrity has actually impacted the work that you do.
I think the good example is the Cincinnati one, the Manse Hotel and Annex in Walnut Hills. When we first took it to the National Registry people in Ohio, they noticed that it was missing a story. There was the top floor was gone and had burned down, I think, after the period of significance even. And so we had to explain that away. Like, was this top story that important? Like, would the owner recognize it? Probably not, because it was different. But on the other hand, there was enough left that it still told the story. So there's that line, I feel like, does it tell it? Can it tell it? And, does the whole thing need to be there?
So what was the story of the Manse Hotel? Will you just give us a 2-second review?
Yeah, the Manse Hotel is a historic Black hotel in Walnut Hills from 1931 to 71. It was, they served a Black and white audience, but it was a regional luxury hotel for African Americans. It was in the Green Book. And Ezra Charles had his press conference there, and he beat Joe Louis. There were a number of NAACP conferences there. The Housewives League met there in the 50s. So it was the epicenter of like social life and civil rights in Cincinnati. Sports. Frank Robinson from the Cincinnati Reds lived there. James Brown lived there when he recorded at King Studios. So you can only imagine what it was like when you went to breakfast there in 1955, who you would see like having breakfast with you. So when you pull all that together, it really does tell, you don't need that fourth story because they didn't have breakfast there. So it really comes together.
Well, right. And so I think like the thing that strikes me in that story is that the the pristine, perfect condition of the building isn't where the sort of stories are embedded, right? Those are like cultural and social histories that are about the place, and it doesn't matter if it's 3 stories or 4 stories, or right, or two
Right.
stories or 3 stories, yeah, right. And so did you have a hard time convincing the SHPO's office that that made sense, or was there pushback? How did it go?
There was some pushback that it was more like prove it. And so there was a little work on our part on the interior because it had been remodeled in the 70s. And God bless the architect who went in that was working with us with their sledgehammer, found the original floor plan when they started like punching holes in walls. So don't be shy about that. So they found the original stairway that led to the ballroom, which had been lost. And the floor of the restaurant was underneath, like I said, another floor. And so a lot of the features that were people thought were lost turned out to actually be there. So that was another big thing on our side.
Oh
So
yeah, that's awesome.
yeah, poking around really helps.
I know one of the examples that I'm going to talk about later is a church that had an addition, and I know that when I was worried about that church, you steered me to a multi-site nomination that you had done for sites of the civil rights movement in Ohio, and you sort of came up with a justification in there to talk about why additions, which might make people think that a building has lost its integrity, are actually an important part of the story. Do you, how's that strategy going?
That's what actually so far so good. It's going well. Because most of those editions are like the 50s and 60s and 70s. So they're reaching the 50-year mark. And a lot of them had like social aspects to them too at the time, civil rights and social aspects, Black Power things like churches in Cleveland. And a lot of things happened in the edition. So it's just another part of the significance is how we approached it.
So you just have been mentioning significance and period of significance, so I think like sort of what we're getting at here is that there's this disconnect, like I said, between the goals of preservation, which are to be diverse and to tell all the stories of American history, right? And then the methods that we use, which are measured by like the integrity of the architecture and this idea of like there's a set period of significance. Can you talk a little bit more about like what is the period of significance, and then how that kind of maybe limits what how we're able to see um, the the range of stories that a building might be able to tell?
Let's see. Um, I think people limit themselves too much on the period of significance and limit themselves to just one episode rather than a broader theme on some things, especially in neighborhoods and like larger collections of buildings, so that you can catch more. If
Do you think preservation has tools that allow us to use like big, broad periods of significance? Is that something that happens, or do we have to, or is it most often really tight?
no, I think you can do big things. You can do large neighborhoods if you do a broad theme. I'm doing one now in Louisville that has 2,800 properties in it, and it's about white flight and how a neighborhood switches over to Black occupancy and the how that works along the way, like the battles and like community resilience that goes along with that. So
And so how do you define period of significance there?
um, we use the census records, and so yeah, and the percentage of who live there and the boundaries of the neighborhood and where people were allowed to move. So you get boundaries and significance kind of at the same time.
So do you say like the period of significance begins when it was a white neighborhood and ends when it becomes totally a Black neighborhood?
Yeah, but usually that runs out the 50-year mark too, because it'll go beyond that. So
Yeah.
some historical events are still underway.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to remember too.
Yeah,
Like
and
it's
honestly, that's another place that preservation is kind of lacking tools, right? We don't
right.
have tools for preserving things that are part of a continuum of time that's still underway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think in the civil rights MPD, we talked about police brutality a lot, and it's ongoing. Like we noted that this is not something that's been solved. Like there's fair housing laws and public accommodations and things like that, but police brutality is just still wide open. So you have to, some things haven't stopped. We're still in the trend.
Yeah. So I wanted to just point out a few like cool resources for people who might want to think more about these questions. The first one is a book that came out in 1996, I think, I'm pretty sure, which is Ned Kaufman's Race, Place, and Story, Essays on the Past and Future of Historic Preservation. And he really starts the ball rolling in thinking about that, how we need to diversify historic preservation practice. I'm sure people know that only 2% of the buildings on the National Register are Black history sites. And I think between 6 and 8% total are sites of diverse history, like, ethnic history and women's history. So he starts, with this series of essays, which he talks about two kind of catalyzing events happened for him. One was the Audubon Ballroom Project in Washington Heights in New York City, and the other one was the African American burial ground in Lower Manhattan, and that the sort of the way that those issues got dealt with and resolved really got him thinking about how limiting historic preservation was, particularly in thinking about Black sites. And so I recommend that book. And then the thing is so that came out in the 90s. And then in 2014, Preservation Forum Journal in, let's see, which was it? The spring 2014 journal was all about diversifying historic preservation practice. And there are two great articles in there. Vince Michael has a thing called Diversity and Preservation, Rethinking Standards and Practices, which has informed my thinking about this a lot. And then there's a second piece in there by Ray Rast, which is called A Matter of Alignment, Methods to Match the Goals of Historic Preservation Movement, which I've actually been referring to throughout this little talk so far, of course. But they use this great example there, that if we had a journal, if there was a journal of a famous person, I think they say Cesar Chavez's journal, and it had been battered and carried around and water damaged and lost some pages, and it was incomplete and it was sort of raggedy. We wouldn't say, oh my gosh, look at everything we've lost, it's missing so much stuff, so it's not important anymore, right? That with a journal like that, we would, conservationists or archivists would immediately say, oh my gosh, let's save what we've got. Like this, we can make, we can learn so much from this remnant, right? But that what historic preservation tends to do, especially around this idea of integrity, is that when a building has been through trials over its lifetime and lost parts and been damaged, we tend to think, oh, not enough left, we're not gonna save it, we're not gonna preserve it, we're not gonna conserve the parts that we've got, we're not gonna learn the stories that thing still has left to tell us. And so it was a really interesting analogy of this sort of different way of thinking about material objects, and particularly written records versus buildings, which sort of brings me to, so feel free to jump in if you want to say stuff about that, but it brings me to thinking about this idea of like, whose stories are we telling? How do we tell those stories? Who do they speak to? Who's included? Who's not included? So I don't know. Do you want to riff on that for a little while, Rory?
Well, yeah. I think since we have like preservation commissions, in front of us, I think a big part of the story is usually the city that these neighborhoods are in, and sometimes the city is complicit in the gaps and the condition of the neighborhood. And it can be uncomfortable at sometimes. Well, like, if you had code enforcement in 1950, or you had, enforce the zoning code and that type of thing, it would look like a more traditionally what people think of as a neighborhood with great integrity. And so I think sometimes it's an uncomfortable period of examination for a commission to look at that. I mean, it's often easier to just say, well, it doesn't have integrity rather than, well, we're part of the reason why it doesn't.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, so.
Do you feel like we are doing a good enough job as preservationists of reaching out or building bridges? I know that the theme of this conference is bridging the gap or something similar. Are we doing what we need to be doing, you think, to sort of fix the disconnect between our goals and our methods?
I think we're getting better. I think younger preservationists are really good at it. So I think like the kids are really picking up the slack, which I'm really glad about. So that's good to see. They're not really shy about like, let's go out and, talk with people and see what's going on. So it's refreshing to see, people my age and older are just kind of like, I don't know, I think a little fusty about it. So, but getting up and mixing it up. So I think it's getting better faster.
Awesome. That's amazing. So we decided that we were going to do this chit chat for about 20 minutes, and we've honestly been at it for about 20 minutes. So are there other things that you wanted to say or add?
Keep preserving. But yeah, I mean, just keep looking at the neighborhoods that or buildings that you might overlook and give it another shot and think about it and just come at it in a different way.
And do you think, like, what should people do if I know that this is part of your experience, that you've had some times where people have said, no, that thing's not worthy of preservation, and that you've kind of done an end run around that a couple times and figured out how to be creative. Do you have any advice for people who want to do it that way?
I think one thing to do is you could roll people with research. If there's enough information about it, that makes a huge difference. And if you come at the integrity angle with a story behind it, I think that also goes a long ways. So if you can explain, if you can explain away the integrity problem, there's not a problem anymore. And so, but what why is there a problem?
What do we do about a situation where, like, we don't have as much, because archives are kept by largely, white mainstream organizations, we might not have as much information about Black history sites. Are we, dead in the water if that's the situation?
No, I find like usually if you talk to people in the neighborhood, they're fond of information and they have something in the attic about it. And just Black newspapers are great too. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I think people might overlook that it takes a while to go through it all. But now that things are searchable, it's not as much of a hassle as it was 20 years ago. So, but I think the main thing is just talk with people about it because they will tell you what's important in their neighborhood.
All right. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go share some case studies for Cincinnati. Any last words?
Nope.
All right. So we're gonna Rory and I are gonna sign off, and I'm gonna come back in a second and talk and lay out these case studies with Carlton. All right. Thanks so much for joining the conversation, and we'll
have a good day, everybody.
Good luck with your nomination.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. Take care.
Hey, bye.
Bye-bye.